Go. Our question for discussion this morning: when you were a child and were woken up in the middle of the night, what did you typically do? Did you go back to sleep easily? Did you get out of bed? Would you go to a parent? And if you have or had children, what did they do when they woke up in the middle of the night?
Well, Wendy was a sleepwalker, and that was a very, very scary experience because she would be sound asleep and you'd say, yeah, and really was non-responsive as she's walking. So that was a tough time. So she outgrew that.
Bet.
When I was in 4th or 5th grade, we moved from East Haven, Connecticut up to Latham. And I was adjusting to new school and so forth. And I was having troubles going to sleep at night at that age. And it was so bad that my mother had to just rest at she would just rest at the foot of the bed until I went to sleep. For probably, I don't know if it was like days or weeks or what. It wasn't endless, and that was the only thing I remember in my life of anything like that.
Well, we have a super active Colin who, when the doctor would say like, oh, has he started sleeping through the night yet? We would just laugh. I don't think he's slept through the night in 11 years, but typically, like, he's so used to being awake in the middle of the night. The thing that makes me laugh when you ask that question, he was probably 3 or 4 years old, and he got up in the middle of the night and tiptoed down the hall to his little, like, Duplo Lego bin, and I found him just sitting there building. And I was like, honey, what are you doing? Well, I'm awake, so it's time to play. So, yeah, he's not the typical, like, Caleb would always come find us, you know, he would want comfort and to have us help him go back to sleep, but Colin was just so matter of fact about it, like, I don't sleep, so I might as well play. Yeah. And
Michelle, I can identify with that. I think Luke started sleeping through the night like late into age 6. And, I mean, I say that the only question is whether he was 7 first, but I think he was 6 before.
Yeah,
but
Colin
he wouldn't play. He would wake up and he would start calling us in. He would never come into our room because he was scared of like the dark hallway. He just wanted us to come in, and then he'd just want to chat.
Yeah.
Sometimes he would just talk for like literally over an hour, and like, look, we'll talk tomorrow. Like, now is not the time to have life conversations. You know, he just has so much on his mind he'd want to talk to you about.
Yep, that's Colin.
My Laura, we never thought she was going to sleep through the night. She too was like Luke, and that she just was awake and always. I can remember the first time she slept through the night, and I woke up and it was daylight, and I was like, maybe she died, you know, because we were just like so used to every night being awakened, you know, by her. And she wanted us to come to her too. Boy, that was a long time.
My hardest experience was the fact, and this has nothing to do with my child, but my husband, when he was very sick near the end, he would call. I was sleeping in a separate bedroom then, and he would call in and he'd say, Jenny, I can't breathe. And I'd go in and sit next to him. By then he was sitting up on the side of the bed, and I would sit next to him and just rub his shoulder or his back and just say, ask him how he was doing. And he'd say, better now. Now that I'm sitting, I'm better. And after a few minutes, I'd go back to bed and he'd lay down and go back to sleep.
Good. I'm sure that was startling, Jenny, to be woken up like that.
It was startling, but it was quite regular.
Yeah.
It was more concerning.
Yeah.
Because nobody had ever diagnosed that.
Yeah.
which I think was sleep apnea. I do think it was sleep apnea because it always went away when he sat up.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about an experience where a young Samuel is trying to sleep through the night and his sleep is interrupted a few different times. So we're going to be looking at chapter 3 of 1 Samuel. But before we go there, we're just going to get a little background on a character named Eli, who plays a prominent role in the story as well. So we're going to start by reading chapter 2, verse 22 through 26. Now, you should know that Eli is the high priest in the area, or just the priest. There's no real high priest. The temple has not yet been built. It's not going to be built for a couple generations yet. But there are places where there's worship, and certainly the tabernacle, the tent, and maybe even it seems a more permanent building is happening. And there seems to be, Eli seems to be a priest of some rank, if not the highest rank at this time. So would somebody be willing to read chapter 2, verse 22 through 26 for us?
Sure.
Thank you, Rick.
Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men.
So our first question, Samuel, who will eventually anoint Saul and then David to be Israel's kings, was dedicated as a child to serve God by his mother Hannah. Samuel served in the temple under the priest Eli. Now the tent of meeting, which we read about, that's the tabernacle tent, which is where the Ark of the Covenant is. When they were in the wilderness, the Israelites would pitch the tent and take it down. It seems like it's been put up in a more permanent place, and it even seems like maybe there's a more permanent structure now. But Samuel served in the temple under Eli. That's why we can say the temple and not the tent. What can we tell about the priest Eli and Eli's family line from this reading?
Eli seemed very devout and true to God, but that didn't seem to ring true with his sons.
And why would that be problematic?
Usually weren't the priests follow in line, father to son, to son, to son, to son, so to speak?
So his sons were supposed to be the next priests. And they're not exhibiting good behavior. So is that on Eli or is that on his sons?
I would say his sons.
It does seem that Eli is not happy about the situation, but it also seems like there's not a whole lot he can do about it at this point, right? So
also, I think the system, we've seen that happen in our own country when, sons follow fathers into high levels of government, not always turn out to be the best decision that our country has made. And I think when you just make assumptions that these people are going to be good and will, do what's best for the community, I think we shouldn't assume such things.
and this is true of, we read of medieval kings and European kings where the monarchy passes down, and queens. Queens are not exempt from this either. Sometimes the family lineage is wonderful and sometimes not so great. Sometimes children turn out to be better than their parents in those kind of respects. Sometimes not at all. I know I've seen it in ministry too. it's rare that a child follows a parent in ministry in the same place and that it works out well. There's usually something that it usually doesn't work out all that. Something happens, or there's some sort of expectations that aren't met, those kind of things. Thankfully, in our kind of tradition, that doesn't happen as often, but it still does now and again. So we get into our text then, which we'll be focusing on this week, and that's going to be Samuel chapter 3. So we know a little bit about Eli's backstory. We know his sons are bad people, and that they are doing different things. That one, they're sleeping with the women who serve right outside of the tabernacle, but they're also doing some other things that were listed in the previous chapters that were further evidence of their wrongdoing. But now we're going to get into 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1 through 10. So I'll take a turn reading here, and then we'll look at some questions. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel, Samuel." Or the Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli, and he said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So what might be the cause of what verse 1 describes? The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread.
Well, a loss of believing or a loss of following the traditions and any looking for God.
So that's an interesting comment. What would be the other possibility? There's two sides to that coin.
Something, I didn't hear, you hadn't said it, two sides of the coin before. I was thinking something about his eyesight.
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's not
Here
verse
about
1.
His eyesight was very bad.
We'll get to that in just a second, Ginny.
Okay.
That's verse 2 in our Bibles. Verse 1 is that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not
Oh,
widespread.
that's right. I have 1 through 3.
And one of the possibilities is that the followers had kind of turned away. So could there be another explanation?
It says here that the revelation of God was rarely heard or seen at that time.
Right.
Could God be mad at the people because of their behavior?
Thank you, Donna. I was trying to lay it out for us. Yeah. So two sides of the coin. One is that the word of God was rarely heard and visions were not seen because God wasn't giving them.
Yeah.
The other
God's
side,
angry.
which we're gonna use as our working hypothesis, because I think it plays out here, is what Mom Eileen had said, that it might be that the followers weren't worthy of hearing, or they weren't looking or listening. So there's two parts to it, though. That one, God might not have been speaking much in those days because because God was concerned with the people. The other is that God could be speaking all God wants to. If nobody's listening, there's not a whole lot of hearing, right?
Right.
So anybody who's ever tried to speak to a child who doesn't want to listen to you, it doesn't matter what you say to them. If they're not going to listen, they're not going to listen. So, you know, and they could say, you never told me that. You could say, I've been telling you that the whole time, but you just haven't been listening, right? So one of those two things might be happening. A little of both could be happening. But it's important to note that I think sometimes people place this on God right away. Oh, God was silent. Not necessarily. It might have been that people were closing their ears.
Isn't this during the whole time of Judges? So like the time where, you know, they kept putting their expectations on a new like leader of Israel to like pull them out of their mess, and they were relying on these new, isn't this the time where if you go back in like Chronicles or wherever, you would see, you know, and then there was a new judge and this one was good, but then there was a new one and that one was bad and led the people far away. Like that whole cycle.
Absolutely, Michelle. And people, like, it's going to come to a head, actually. This is a good point, that the people will be demanding a king.
Okay.
And Samuel, who's a boy right now, is going to grow into a leader. I was going to say this for later, but Samuel doesn't really become the priest of Israel. He becomes the prophet of Israel. Because even though he operates as a priest, his biggest function in this time is forthtelling, not telling the future, not foretelling, but telling God's word to the people, right? So the people continue to ask for a king. And that's what all these judges have been doing to some effect, and sometimes not very well. And the people keep saying, we want a king to lead us. We want a king to lead us. And God's here saying, I've been here the whole time. You don't need a king. You know, you just need faithfulness. And so Samuel becomes kind of the conduit for all of that. I mean, Samuel's going to be the one who chooses God's king twice.
Yeah.
So he has such an important role to play, and he does it. He doesn't do it enthusiastically. He does it because the people demand it, and God says, "Fine, I'll give you a king if that's what you want." But it's not going to go well, you know. And Samuel's a willing prophet, and Samuel's a willing priest, but Samuel's not exactly agreeing with the people. Right? That's going to happen later, not right now. But yes, absolutely, that is all part of the context of what's going on at this time in Israel's history.
Well, Chris, also, I think we listen with the filters of our own experiences, and Samuel probably sort of decided, well, this is what I understand I'm supposed to do. So his filters were to do that. And then when the Lord appears to him, it doesn't make any sense to him that the Lord is actually going to speak to him and use him in a way that he hasn't yet anticipated or understood.
And he's just a kid. He's, you know, we're talking about like a preteen probably right now. So the idea that even if he thought he was going to grow to be this one day, this has got to be confusing, which we're going to get into that for sure in the next. So let's move into the next question here. But yeah, good point. God pronounces a judgment on Eli's family in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 33. So we read the part where we established Eli's sons weren't that great. I'm going to tell you what the punishment could be. God is going to cut everybody off. Nobody in his family is ever going to live to old age again. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep out his eyes and grieve his heart. All the members of your household shall die by the sword. Another translation that I've read said something like, the only ones who will be spared, their eyes will be so filled with tears they won't be able to see. Okay. So what does verse 2 lead us to believe? And Jenny, you mentioned this before, but I'll read the verse 2 specifically. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room.
He was perhaps just getting old and not able to really carry out what he was supposed to do.
It could be that he was just getting old.
Kind of see it also as like a coming to fruition that he's mourning, like his eyes are, I kind of think of Leah in Genesis. Her eyes are tired and weak because they've been crying so much. And so I wonder if that could also be a possible explanation for Eli's dim eyes.
So it could be that God's judgment was coming true in a way, not because his eyes were always filled with tears, but that yeah, even Eli, his and what could it mean when somebody says, "Oh, they have poor vision"? What could that mean? Joyce, yes, Joyce is chuckling.
It might mean we're wearing a mask and our glasses are foggy
Yes,
all
that
the
could
time
be
when
part
you
of it.
walk outside.
Could it be a symbolic, like when you have poor visions, you don't see clearly, you don't see what's happening around you?
So his eyesight had become dim. It's probably literal, but there could be a very figurative and spiritual connotation here that Eli was losing his grip.
Yeah.
That he just wasn't the priest he was supposed to be by now. Very literally and figuratively. So that one verse has a lot that can unpack in there.
Well, I can tell you from experience that when you lose your vision, it disorients you. I mean, you don't seem to have the same perspectives. It makes you uneasy. You know what I'm saying?
Joyce, you speak on two levels there. So we can all imagine that if you literally lose your vision, it would disorient you. But in the same way, if you lose your perspective, if you lose your focus on the horizon or whatever, your vision in that way, it's also very disorienting, right?
Right.
So in a literal sense, think of being a sailor and sailing to a point and all of a sudden you lose your perspective. You don't know where you are anymore. You're on the open sea. You have to reorient yourself. As a person, you think you're working toward one goal and you realize that's not the case. You lose your perspective. So Joyce, while you speak literally, your words also impact us very, like, in a much bigger way too. It's the same truth holds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another figurative and literal here in verse 3. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was dying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. What's the figurative understanding of that verse, and what's the literal understanding? The literal understanding you might not be able to understand unless you have a study Bible which tells you the literal understanding.
Well, the literal was the golden lampstand in the temple, and I guess there's a flame on there that's supposed to be kept burning all the time.
From evening till morning. So during the dark hours, there's a flame that's supposed to be kept in the temple, in the ark room, that it's supposed to stay lit the whole night. So we think that tells us that's a clue of what time of evening it was. It tends to be toward the morning, right? Because the flame had not yet gone out, but it seems like it is going towards going out.
I like the figurative meaning there, like no matter how dim it seems or dark, that there's still hope, or the light of God is not, snuffed out yet, that there's...
It's a perfect image, right? Both the literal and the figurative are a perfect image for what's happening and what's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks pretty dark, but there's still a little light left. It's just not as clear and as bright as people would hope or that it once was, right? So the scene is set here for all kinds of things to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens to Samuel in the passage here, and why does he keep going to Eli?
I don't... Yeah, go ahead.
He doesn't recognize God's voice. He doesn't recognize. And he may be somewhat sleepy himself and is like, wait, I hear something.
He's the first time for sure. He seems like he probably was woken up in a deep sleep, but his job was to attend to the candle, or the lamp, I should say, not the candle. So he had to kind of be check in on that lamp once in a while, but you would imagine he was pretty well out of it when the first time he heard it. So he's disoriented there for sure. Definitely didn't recognize that this, we figure that he thinks Eli's calling him, right?
That's a good assumption to make, though. If if you're not used to the Lord calling you in the middle of the night, you assume it's the person in the next room or lying near you.
Wouldn't you think so?
One would hope so.
One would hope so, right? Yeah, I think I would hope so. Even if I did think it was the Lord, I'd prefer perhaps it was the person in the next room. Getting woken up in the middle of the night by the Lord seems like something's going to happen. I would imagine that would be a scary thing.
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that out.
And listen, I'm a minister. I love God. I love serving God. But if God woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me a message, it would scare me because
Yeah, I'm glad you're pointing that out.
know something is going to happen, and you're not going to be able to say, well, that's not my job. That must be somebody else's. Nope, that's your job.
I had a kind of a strange experience maybe 2 weeks ago. My doorbell rang and I went to the door. I wasn't far away from it and there was absolutely no one there. There was no one in view anywhere near my house. So I'm thinking, oh goodness, what caused that? And I still don't really know, but I didn't see any visions. I didn't hear anyone speaking to me other than that doorbell ringing.
And there was no Amazon package waiting at your doorstep?
Huh?
There was no Amazon package waiting at your doorstep?
Nope.
Just some kids playing.
I checked even
Bring
my
it on.
garage.
Just some kids playing ding dong ditch.
Yeah, right. That's right.
I would have known what happened when I was a kid. We did it so often. We ring doorbells and run.
Mom lives in a retirement community, so it would be childish people, not children.
Yeah.
But still could be the truth. It's just the kids who live near her would be getting away with a cane rather than a scooter. So how does Eli, so Samuel gets woken up 3 different times. And especially when we think back to our experience as a child or with children or with a loved one who might need care in the middle of the night. You get woken up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I wake up and I think I hear Luke and I go into his room and he's sleeping. But it's just my immediate assumption is that I heard a sound. It must be my son. I better go check on him, right? So Samuel must have thought it was Eli 3 different times. How does Eli show his wisdom in the passage? And how does he fulfill his role as Samuel's guardian?
Well, he finally realizes that Samuel was not hearing things, but he's hearing God speaking to him and tells him it's God speaking. Go sit down and listen.
Right.
See, I think that, I don't know that I would think about God speaking, especially if you're saying that it wasn't normal in those days. That Eli thought that is interesting to me. I don't know.
I would hope, Joyce, that if you slept one room over from the Ark of the Covenant where your people say God literally was dwelling, that you'd at least leave the possibility open. I agree with you. Don't get me wrong. I agree with you. But I would hope that Eli would at least say, oh, now that you mention it, there is that whole holy of holy room that you're sleeping in. It could just mean that actually God is showing up, So good on Eli that even though his vision is dim, he understands that maybe something's going on here. And he helps Samuel understand what to do. Just when next time you hear it, just say, speak, for your servant is listening. He kind of says to Samuel, this is how you clarify things, and this is how you focus on what's about to happen. So would somebody be willing to read the rest of that chapter for us, verse 11 to 21?
I can read.
Thank you.
And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called to him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word.
Thank you, Michelle. So what's God's message to Samuel?
Oh,
Pretty harsh.
tell him that Eli's family is done for. And that God isn't even going to allow forgiveness for them, which is even worse.
There will be, and this anticipates question 8. My translation, I like it because it uses a good theological word. I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall never be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever.
Yep.
So atoned for is a good synonym, but there will never be a time they will not be able to cover up this sin. It will never be wiped or cleared or anything. There's nothing that they can do. So the priest, Eli, whose function is to mediate between the people and God and help cover up and atone their sins through sacrifice, like he already said to his sons, listen, when somebody messes up between their other people, God can be the mediator, or someone can mediate to the Lord on behalf of them sinning against one another. But when you sin against God, there's no one who can mediate that. And it's playing out. God is saying to Samuel, nobody's going to be able to make a sacrifice for this one. This is going to be held against them, which is pretty harsh, as has been said, right? So if you're Samuel, what would you think of your first interaction with God and the news you got? And how does he react?
Especially being a kid, I'd be a little afraid.
Yeah. Do you think he wondered what the ramifications were for himself? If all of Eli's family were off the...
From that perspective, Donna,
Yeah.
hard to say. I would say the immediate perspective, he definitely understood there could be ramifications, which is why he just went back to sleep.
Get a headache.
Like, oh boy, I gotta say that to Eli. I think I'm gonna sleep on that. You know?
The very first message that he's ever given from God, the very first task is to tell his, his father figure, essentially his
Mentor.
That's the word I was looking for. That he's doomed, and his whole family.
Doomed.
Talk about a hard first job.
Not just his mentor, but the highest authority in all of his nation. He isn't quite a nation yet, but in all of his area and in his faith, because they're the same thing. By the way, you know that system of how you and your family are supposed to be governing us?
Anymore.
Here's the thing.
I think he'd be scared for another reason, because perhaps Eli would think that he wanted to usurp.
And
I'm sorry, perhaps Eli would think that Samuel
yeah,
wanted
no,
to usurp
yeah, well said,
get rid
Jim.
of his family and take over.
So there's enough false prophets even in those days that you get a message like that, you have to question its authenticity, right? So you wonder if if that's going through his mind. What do I tell Eli? Because what if he thinks that although Eli has discerned, God's probably speaking, so there is that. But yeah, this could be a dangerous message. And I mean, goodness gracious, I guess on one hand, you know, if Samuel can do this, the rest of it is all easy street. I mean, if this is the first message you get, you can pretty much give any message to anybody because it's not going to get worse than this. But wow, what a first task.
Not to mention, wouldn't have made Samuel think that it's going to lead to like a lot of like unrest, you know, because your leadership is being wiped out or punished.
We don't know how many levels he would understand, but
Right.
yeah, Michelle, there's all of that, right? So there's all kinds of possibilities. I mean, hi, I'm a new architect. Oh, we want you to design our national museum. Like, I was thinking more like a room first, like, you know, holy cow, like, you know, maybe just design the inside interior decoration, maybe a little bit.
What kind of word on that?
Start with some window treatments, right? So this is just a huge first message for Samuel to understand. And I, for one, no matter his motivation for going back to sleep, for trying to understand it, for waiting to tell Eli, no matter what his motivation, I think it was the right decision. All of us need to sleep on it sometimes. So that's actually, it seems to me like that's a decent message to get out of this, as long as what happens next happens. In other words, Samuel doesn't avoid things. He just takes a moment, right? So what does Eli ask of Samuel? And what do you think Eli may have expected Samuel to be saying to him?
I feel like Eli knew it wasn't something good.
Yeah.
He like threatens him immediately. You know, I'm gonna curse you if you don't tell me every bit of what he said. Like, you know, he didn't seem to be expecting good news.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
once you start, don't abandon whatever it is you start, or abandon the relationship. I'm thinking today in the Asbury Park Press, there's this building that was the construction was started right on the pier there, and it's got all the, you know, the rebar and everything is sort of there, and then it was abandoned, and it's been there for years, abandoned, and finally the governing people just said, we're going to remove this because it's an eyesore. It invites drug distribution there, and all kinds of bad things are happening. So we're gonna remove it because no one is claiming it anymore. And I think you wanna, if you've been through what the people historically had been through, you don't want to sort of trust a blind old man to be making your decision about who's the future leader here.
No, a 13-year-old boy, much better.
Both decisions do not sound good. It's like, give us a third option.
So, yeah, but it's right though. You know, Eli doesn't want to hear halfway. He doesn't want it sugar-coated. Eli's understands enough to understand this probably isn't going to be good. Plus, if God had a good message for Eli, wouldn't God give that message to Eli?
Yeah.
Like, you know, visions and messages may have been rare in those days, but I think Eli still understands what to expect here.
You know, it's sort of like some people don't want to hear a problem that's involving them. I'm thinking in our government, they don't want to hear it. So they won't confront it themselves.
Yeah, and does Eli say to Samuel, well, that's a bunch of fake news?
No, he accepts it. He says he is the Lord. Let him do what's good in his eyes.
So credit to Eli, he gets terrible news. And he says, that's the Lord's right to do that.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, Eli has been seen historically as kind of a weak leader because he couldn't even control his sons. In other ways, I think maybe he doesn't have force of personality, but he seems to be faithful because he seems to accept the Lord's provision to do what the Lord wants to do, the providence of God, and he seems to accept the message. And he doesn't just walk away. He doesn't desert Samuel at that moment, and I just can't to think about that interaction, to think about, Samuel, what do you say? You sure you want to do this now, Eli? Okay. Just Samuel has to do this, and then Eli hears it and just says, it's the end of the road.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's eternally, like Eli is cut off from God eternally. Like what does that actually mean as far as his punishment? You know how God said he can't ever be forgiven.
Well, you're putting a Christian perspective into a Jewish and barely Jewish. I mean, we're not even talking codified.
I just don't understand like what that would have meant. What?
I don't know that they would have had
or was it like just a physical then and now context? Like that's as far as they would take it. Like anyway, I'm probably just.
I think that they would have. I think that it's likely they would have understood that to be very temporal, very earth specific, not have eternal weight behind it. I'm not sure that they understood much of an eternal concept. They certainly didn't have it developed like Christians do today. So it's a good question. I just don't think it applies.
Okay.
Well, the whole concept of communication back then, they didn't have television. They didn't have ways other than in person or via messenger.
I mean, let's back up. They didn't have writing. So before, like, these are oral traditions that later get written down, right? So like, even still, we're close to the time that they start transcribing these things, but that comes around King David. We're still before King David by 2 generations, or at least a full generation. So yes, no TV, also no transcribing of the events just yet. Go ahead, sorry.
I can't get over the fact that they stressed in verses 19 through 21, the whole end of that story, they stress in extreme Samuel's pureness, his flawlessness, his acceptance and recognizes Samuel was a real thing, a true prophet, and that continued at Shiloh. Why is the person writing this story stressing that so strongly?
Jenny, Samuel's going to anoint 2 kings. So the first person he's going to anoint is Saul, which in and of itself is its own thing. But then he's going to take that away from Saul and anoint David, which is going to be super controversial because it sets up warring factions. David serves Saul and Saul's family, and then they become enemies. And so
he has to be trusted as a true prophet.
Because otherwise it could be Samuel's decision and not the Lord. So we have to establish here Samuel's credibility. And so Samuel's credibility is beyond reproach. We know, the first thing he does is go to his mentor and guardian and tell him he's going to be cut off from the Lord. Samuel deals with hard news, and he deals with it forthright and honestly. And we know that from the beginning, right? So that helps us understand later in the story when we say, I wonder if Samuel just fell out with Saul. Did he just choose David to mix it up? Like, no, this was the Lord, right? The Bible says so, but even the people at that time had to, Samuel's credibility would have been beyond reproach. So they had to understand that something was happening. And the way this establishes it, the poetic language is really great in my particular translation, even though I don't tend to have a poetic translation. The Lord the Lord let none of his words fall to the ground. It's like Samuel's uttering words and people are just like grabbing like bubbles. You blow bubbles like little kids chasing bubbles. They won't let them touch the ground. Everything Samuel says has an audience. It's heard. So, you know, the word of the Lord, hearing the word was rare in those days. Not anymore. Everything Samuel says, people hear it. It's becoming more common now. He becomes known from Dan to Beersheba. Does anybody have an understanding of what that is? Does anybody have a reference in their Bible about what that is?
Isn't that kind of north to south?
Dan's the furthest village or city north. Beersheba's the furthest city south in Israel. He becomes known far and wide, from the north to the south, in all of the land. That's the way you say that.
And that's the first verse of chapter 4 that follows all this. And Samuel's word came to all Israel.
Right. And interestingly, it says the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, which is where Eli and Samuel are, right? So we think that this precurses the actual, like Solomon's temple, the big temple. We think that there's some sort of a intermediate temple, not the tent, but the temple at Shiloh, because the Lord continues to kind of be active there before the main temple is built. So all of this stuff packed in there. So how do things change between verse 1 and 21?
Well, you see Samuel come into his own. It's kind of like the evolution of here, you know, what happened, where were the turning points? And at the end, now he's it. He's
This is huge. Yes. Samuel has all of a sudden become a huge figure in the history of the people right now.
And God goes from not saying much to speaking all the time.
I know, a changing of the guard.
Yeah. So the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Ends up, the Lord continued to appear, and God revealed himself to Samuel by the word of the Lord. You go from the word of the Lord is rare to God speaking all the time and no word hits the ground.
Mm-hmm.
This is a huge transition in the few years of the life of Samuel here that we're talking about.
One of the results, implications of this is that the people of Israel can have some sense of assurance when things are rough and things are going crazy, that God is speaking in their midst through Samuel. It must give them some sort of steadiness and assurance through that period you're describing about Saul and David and everything like that.
And I might too, Jenny, think that this would lead people to understand that it's not God who's absent. It's us that wasn't listening. It's we who were not listening. You know, it's to kind of say, oh yeah, okay, we thought God was present. We weren't sure, but oh, it took Samuel coming about. So maybe it was us. Maybe we had the problem. Maybe this wasn't a God thing. Maybe this was a people thing, you know? So an interesting perspective to be sure, but yes, it sets them up to kind of be hearing from God in the days to come too.
And trust him.
Just
And
makes me have more, it makes me have more empathy for Eli in a sense, because he's the one who says, Samuel, you need to listen to the Lord. And just not really knowing what would happen. I mean, Eli kind of like sealed his fate in that. And so I feel for Eli. I feel like he's...
And to know Samuel's hearing from God, even though Eli didn't. And Eli's thinking, well, I tried,
Yeah.
but I guess it just wasn't me.
But also the story they chose, the people chose to continue to tell the stories, and the value of Eli in this story, and then the value of turning it over to Samuel and watching him grow up and mentoring him and making sure that this was going to be the continuation of what he felt was the commitment for Samuel in the future. He saw that, obviously.
So he steps aside to allow Samuel to really take on the mantle of leadership, which is pretty incredible for Eli, because it doesn't just come with being placed on the sidelines. It comes with a curse, which that's got to be difficult.
I just feel really bad for him that it's because of the behavior of his sons. Like, I know he even went to them and tried to stop their misdeeds. It's not like he openly condoned it or told them it was okay.
But Michelle, Rick and I can tell you that anything a pastor's kid does reflects directly on the pastor. So, that's just what it is. That's how it always was and shall be.
Was and shall be.
Well, and let me point out that it's not easy to be in the position of a parent, raising children in a temple or a church.
You didn't like living your life?
Everybody has an opinion of everything you do, and they let you know about it.
You didn't like living your life in a fishbowl, Mom?
Oh, it was great. I didn't like
Eileen, I sort of understand what you're saying, because I lived with a brother who raised his kids, of course, in the parsonage, and I watched this unfold over the years.
That's
so
what
I understand what you're saying.
Well, and people also assume
It's very hard. It was harder for my grandson Stephen than my nephew. It was harder for Stephen, my brother's son, than it was for Beth, his daughter. She coped with the parsonage, but it was very hard for Stephen living in that.
No, it's a colleague of mine has said to his kids all the time, you will grow up in a fishbowl, and that comes with it some problems that everybody's always going to know what you're doing, but you'll be the only kids in church to get birthday cards and Christmas gifts from random people too. So, there is that. So had Eli's sons been faithful, I'm sure the people would have been really happy about that and rejoiced with them. So yeah, it is true. But we're going to conclude with our questions for reflection. As we go, just thinking about this on your own. When you hear bad news, do you react like Eli? Do you challenge it? Do you ignore it? And how does your reaction change the news? How does it change you? So thinking about how Eli reacted to bad news, and how does the reaction that we might have, does it change the news we get? Does it change us? So with that, I appreciate your participation as we study this key aspect and moment in Samuel's life, and Eli's life, you might say too, and really the life of the early Israelites right before the kingdom starts to come about with Saul and then with King David. So thanks all for joining. It's nice to see your faces again this morning, and I look forward to continuing our studies in the days to come. So peace be with you. Take care. See you again soon.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks.